keep beginning videos by saying that I'm unusually busy with actual paid research, but I don't normally talk specifically about individual projects that I'm working on, for obvious reasons. Today, however, I'm making an exception. For the past couple of years, I've been assisting Dr. David Scott with some research into a series of incidents that occurred in East Lancashire almost 200 years ago, and in 1826 were considered a riot. But the events that took place in 1826 are now being examined in minute detail, re-evaluated, reinterpreted and recognised not as a riot but as an uprising. Until 2022 I had never heard of this incident, this series of incidents, but I've become very familiar with it. And plans are now underway to commemorate the bicentenary of the event in April 2026. A new charity has been created, the Weavers Uprising Bicentenary Committee, the idea being to foster interest in an event that didn't always really receive a great deal of attention in the past. Certainly I studied social and economic history at GCSE level, we did the textile industry, not a mention was made of 1826 in East Lancashire. So why is it worth knowing about? Briefly, textile workers, often with whole families involved, were seeing their wages drop to the point where they could barely afford food, and essentially they were slowly starving. On the 18th of April 1826, the situation in Blackburn was that bad that the Preston Chronicle was able to report that there have been 14,000 individuals out of a population of 26,000 inhabitants relieved with provisions weekly. In other words, about 53% of Blackburn was receiving a food parcel of some kind. If that happened today, then they would need food parcels for 66,241 people, just to give you an idea of the scale. So the handloom weavers had asked for an increase in wages. They'd asked for some recognition for their handiwork, and at one stage some of those in Blackburn actually formed a union and wrote to the Secretary of State. But it made no difference. So over the course of a few days at the end of April, what was described frequently in the newspapers as a mob moved from town to town across East Lancashire. Some branches even headed off towards Yorkshire, taking their frustration out on the power looms. The militia, of course, were called in to restore order, and late in April 1826 they opened fire in Chatterton near Ramsbottom. A number of people were arrested. Some people were transported to Australia. At least 6 were fatally shot. They're the known victims, including the extremely unlucky Mary Simpson, who was a young married woman about 23, 24 years old, who was just waiting to board a coach to Manchester in the centre of the town and was hit by a stray bullet. From what I've been able to work out through research, even more tragically, she was just a few days away from, I think it was a 4th wedding anniversary, so maybe she was getting the coach into Manchester because she was going out shopping in advance of her anniversary. And so I began several very intensive sessions of newspaper research into the events at Chatterton. And when I looked back through some of the material that I'd collected, I started to notice that there were 1 or 2 contradictions, which always happens in old newspapers. The Lancaster Gazette refers to one casualty at Chatterton as James Whatacre, the person who was shot when entering an old woman's house. James Whatacre is a really unusual case. He's the odd one out in the whole incident, because he's the only known case where, when the jury looked into the cause of his death, the inquest gave a verdict of willful murder. The Morning Herald, however, disputes the description of the woman whose house he went into with some very convincing details. In a cottage near the mill lives Betty Upton, a young woman with one child, having buried her husband a few weeks before the catastrophe. That is useful stuff. There are details to be pulled out of that and checked up on. A genealogist's dream. The Morning Herald shows us that it hadn't just plucked this idea out of thin air, it hadn't just created this character, by saying that Widow Upton, who is only 28 years old, gave evidence at the inquest into the death of James Whatacre. He was a married man, about 40 years old, with a teenage son. He was living at Alderbottom, just between the River Irwell and the junction of the A56 and the M66, so it's in the Ramsbottom area. And he worked for the Rostrons, who were a mill-owning family, and he'd actually gone to the mill that morning specifically to take out any functioning parts of the factory machinery that were in danger of being damaged. On Sunday the 28th of April, 2024, I was invited to tell Betty Upton's story at a commemorative event organised by the Weavers Uprising Bicentenary Committee. So I had a challenge now. I had to tell her story. So I went back to the newspapers and I tried to plot out exactly what happened in her house that day. Who might have been with her. I couldn't fit quite every detail into the piece that I wrote, but there was enough to form a short reading. And this is what I came up with. I never imagined being a widow at 28. On the 26th of April, 1826, my husband William Upton had been buried 20 days. We knew James Whatacre. He lived not far from here, at Alderbottom, with his wife. They had a son about 14 years old, not much younger than my sister Alice. He worked for the Rostrons at Tottington, and he was a good man, the family to provide for. They say there were looms being broken all over Lancashire that month. Crowds of men and boys, even women and girls, walking from town to town, breaking the looms apart, tearing the cloth from them. And we could only imagine it, until it came to Chatterton. I can't read newspapers, but those who can say it's being called a riot. Those involved, they call the mob. That day, Wednesday, soldiers stopped some of the crowd on the road near Mr. Aiken's mill. My sister Alice and our friend Mary Holding were staying in my cottage, helping to look after my little boy. He turned 2 years old just before his father was buried, and his grandfather, my father, didn't like to leave 3 young women by themselves with so much upheaval going on. So that morning he came to the cottage to nail up the door for safety. Through the upstairs window I saw a familiar figure. James Whatacre walking towards my cottage. And just as he raised his hand to knock at the door, I saw a flash of red across the road. He fell down. "Whatacre is shot," I told them. Father came closer to the window. There were soldiers coming to the door, to my door. I went downstairs with Father, hiding against the wall between the door and the kitchen window. The curtains moved, and they thrust something through the window. A rifle. It was soldiers' voices that we heard. I see her again. Shoot her. They meant me. They meant to kill me. They'd seen me. What had I done? Another voice demanded that we open the door. My father told them it was nailed up, but thinking to appease them, he promised to help them if they forced it with their shoulder. As soon as they were in, one took hold of Father by his collar, shouting, "Who are you?" Perhaps they thought he was one of the crowd, breaking the looms, hiding in here to evade them. I am her father, he told them, meaning me. These girls are my daughters. I came here to protect them. I would not have argued with them. One soldier seized me, promising to blow my brains out. But what had I done? I pleaded for my life, of course. Would they shoot a widow of 3 weeks? Could Father and Alice care for my little boy, or would he be left to the mercy of the parish? And yet these soldiers pulled me up the stairs, beat me, and if you care to imagine what else they might do to a woman alone, they did. I was sure they'd do the same to my sister Alice. Father's voice came to the room a moment before he did. "Gentlemen, these are my daughters." And that was fierce enough to frighten them, and thank God they desisted, and that gave me courage. I took hold of the arms of one who had restrained me. "I will not be shot in my own house," I told him. "I have not stirred from home." I reminded them that I was Mr. Aiken's neighbour. "I have nothing to do with the mob, and you shall not shed my blood upon my own floor." Now between us, Father and I had unsettled them. But then it was our turn to be shocked. There was a noise under the bed. There was a man hiding beneath it. Who he was I couldn't say, but no one knew. We knew at least. And as they hustled him out of the door, I remembered. James Whatacre had been coming to this house when they shot him. Could he have escaped? Was he alive? We found him outside. Blood all over the ground, coming from his right thigh. I can't be sure that he could move, but he was living. I don't know why I asked the men to help me get him inside. They only refused and went away without looking back. Father, Mary and I got him into the house. We put cushions under his head. Alice brought linen to soak up the blood. And my little brother ran as fast as he could to Edenfield to find James's wife. We wondered whether we could find the 10 shillings Mr. Spencer the surgeon would ask to come from Holcombe to attend to him. But James Whatacre was already pale and still losing blood. Too much blood. But he could still speak. "Betty, pray for me," he asked. "I know thou can pray, and I am dying. Look to God and pray yourself, and I will pray with you," I promised. And so we did, for almost an hour. It was all the time James Whatacre had left to live. His family didn't reach our house in time to hear him say, "I am a murdered man." The next Sunday, he was buried at Holcombe Church, aged 40 years. His wife lived on for another 12. I'm told that his son lived to be 33. For the rest of my life, I believe James Whatacre was right to say that he'd been murdered. Perhaps you think so too. Betty Upton clearly existed. Multiple newspaper accounts say that James Whatacre died in her house. She definitely gave a statement at the inquest into his death. But who exactly was she? And how do I know that she had a toddler son? How did I decide to call her sister Alice? Neither of those were random choices. The first clues come in the Trades Free Press, dated Sunday the 4th of June 1826. And that tells us that Betty was 28 years old in April 1826. Her father's name was John Platt. At least one of her sisters was with her, as was a young woman named Mary Holding. They were all in the house at the time. And Betty is quoted as saying that she had only buried her husband 3 weeks earlier. So this is really specific genealogical information. I seem to be looking for here a child called Betty Platt, or possibly Elizabeth, who is born in around about 1798, who would have a father called John, and at least one other female sibling. I'm looking for a marriage between Betty or Elizabeth Platt and a man named Upton before 1826, and I'm looking for the burial of an adult male Upton somewhere, hopefully in the Chatterton area, probably between the 1st and the 10th of April 1826. Can I do it? Let's find out. King Street Wesleyan Chapel in Haslingden no longer exists. It once stood at the corner of King Street and Sheep Green, which runs parallel with Hargreave Street. And I've managed to find an old photograph of the chapel, so I'm going to put that in the description box so you can explore it if you will. The first entry in the baptism registers is dated the 28th of August 1796, and each entry thereafter is numbered. On entry number 22 we find a baby girl. Betty seems to have been the oldest child. On the 7th of July 1800, her little brother George is born at Edenfield. On the 12th of July 1803, a younger sister called Mally, which is probably a variant of Molly, which in turn is a pet form of Mary, was born at Chatterton, which is also within the parish of Bury. Somewhere around 1808, I think, another sister named Alice was born. So far, I haven't yet been able to find out when she was baptised or where. One other oddity that comes up in Betty's story relates to the little boy who's mentioned in the newspapers. Apparently he runs up to the soldiers telling them, "I am Platt's lad." That's John Platt, Betty's father. On the surface, it sounds as though this is Betty's little brother, but there is an alternative explanation for this. Because her mother, formerly Mary Elton, was nearly 60 in 1826. She was still alive. The description of this child gives me the feeling that he's between 5 and 10 years old. He's at a primary school age. So I really don't think that he is Betty's little brother now. Unfortunately, because Betty's father, John Platt, died in 1836, he isn't actually on the census, so I can't be absolutely sure what his occupation was, which means that I can't say whether or not he was a tradesman or a craftsman or somebody with a profession like a shoemaker who might have taken on an apprentice. And apprentices could often be as young as 7 or 8 because there was no formal schooling requirement in 1826. So he could well have had a little apprentice, and that would make sense of why he says, "I am Platt's lad." It's telling that he actually uses that phrase. He doesn't go up and say, "That's my dad," or "That's my sister." He says, "I am Platt's lad," which is an extremely strange way, when you think about it, for a child to be talking about their father. Unless the journalist has just got very, very artistically creative here with his or her narrative. On the 22nd of April 1822, April's coming into it again, Elizabeth Platt married William Upton, a calico printer at St Mary's Parish Church in Bury. Betty was nearly 25, her bridegroom was a little older, about 31, going by his burial record. Both at the time were living in the parish of Bury, which could actually mean that they were living in Chatterton or Edenfield. That would tally with the details on Betty's baptism record that says Edenfield in the parish of Bury. Both sign the register, not with a signature, but with a cross, which is how I know that Betty probably can't read and doesn't seem to be able to write. The evidence that I've found suggests that Betty and William Upton only had one child, a son helpfully named John Platt Upton, and the baby arrived on the 25th of March 1824, apparently in Ramsbottom. Ramsbottom and Chatterton do border each other, so perhaps the Reverend Ramsay, who baptised John at Deardengate Independent Chapel in Haslingden, so it was another nonconformist chapel, on May the 4th, 1824, preferred to record the larger town in his registers. The baptism record also tells us that Betty's husband, John's father, William, was a calico weaver at the time. But in early April 1826, William Upton died at Chatterton. He's only 35 years old, and this is the pre-civil registration period, which means that there is no death certificate. There's also nothing extra written in the parish record to give a clue about the cause of his death. And 20 days later, his widow Betty watches James Whatacre bleed to death. Interestingly, like Betty, James Whatacre was also from a nonconformist family. He was born at Longworth between Bolton and Darwin, and he was baptised at the Walmsley Chapel Presbyterian Meeting House, which is just north of Edgerton near Bolton. Given that Betty was a calico weaver's widow, I don't know whether or not she would have had enough money to send for a doctor. I found in this book that I picked up in the donated books box in the Lancashire Archives tea room. This is a trade directory extracts for Ramsbottom, Edenfield, Holcombe, Tossington, etc. There was a Jonathan Spencer, who was a surgeon, who was living at Holcombe Brook, which is, again, is not far away. Holcombe is actually where James Whatacre was buried. And not only was he a surgeon in the 1820s, he actually lived into the census era, and he turns up in 1851. He's 65 years old, he's living in Little Holcombe with his wife and 3 lodgers. He was then describing himself as a druggist. I'm taking him as my handy local medical man for James Whatacre's story. The other quote in the newspaper that may well be poetic licence, but does, I think, add an interesting touch when we know about Whatacre and Betty's nonconformist upbringing. Perhaps that's the explanation for why James Whatacre apparently says, "I know thou can pray," when he is dying. It's a very Quakerish way of phrasing things, I think, so maybe that explains it. In the space of 3 weeks, Betty Upton buries her husband and then watches James Whatacre die on what may well have been her kitchen floor within the same month. That's quite something for a young woman in her late 20s to go through. And it occurred to me that this is 1826. It's not too long before the 1841 census in relative terms. Betty would have been in her early 40s then. Is it possible that that wasn't the end of the story? She should have been alive to be on the 1841 census. She was born in 1797. She had a son in 1824. Surely one of them was going to be on the census. And besides, logic tells me, and experience, that at 28 the chances are that the widowed Betty Upton might well have remarried and gone on to have more children. In fact, that's exactly what happened to her. On the 16th of May 1833, so 7 years later, she and her second husband, James Roberts, a block printer, also textile worker, were living at Pilkington near Bury when they got married at St Mary the Virgin's Church in Prestwich. And once again, Betty makes a cross on the register instead of signing her name, so that matches up with her marriage to William Upton too. Around a year later, they had a daughter named Mary, which does make complete sense because Betty's son with William Upton was named John, probably after her father, so her daughter with James Roberts is Mary, after her mother and also her sister. And in a detail that all family historians want to find, by 1841, James and Betty Roberts were living in Pilkington. They're still there, where their household includes Betty's widowed mother, Mary Platt, and 15-year-old John Upton, her son from the first marriage, who's a millwright's apprentice. Absolutely perfect. 3 years later, John Platt Upton married Mary Taylor at Manchester Cathedral, and it appears that she died very shortly after the birth of their son William, after his grandfather, I suppose, in 1849. So the next census finds John Platt Upton back in Pilkington, living on Bury Road in Whitefield, which is Pilkington and Whitefield are very close to each other, with his mother Betty. She's now a grocer and a shopkeeper. His half-sister Mary Roberts, who's still a teenager, and also his own toddler son William. On the 25th of April 1859, Betty was still living in Whitefield when she died. The irony is that it was one day short of the 33rd anniversary of James Whatacre's death. Now there's something you couldn't make up. According to the certificate, she'd been suffering from a bleeding cancer in the throat for 12 months, so not a nice way to go. She's 61 years old, and the document also tells us that the informant was related to her, but without actually saying that, because the person who registered the death was John Park. The most likely candidate, John Park, would be her 18-year-old nephew, who was the son of her sister Alice, which is further confirming the link between Alice and Betty. I've yet to find out where Betty Platt was. Betty Upton, who became Betty Roberts, was buried. I don't know whether she's got a gravestone or not. But she is yet another example of what I love about social history and family history. And I think it's also, her story is an absolutely perfect demonstration of why you shouldn't limit your research to the census records. And maybe it also goes to show that you can actually find out a huge amount about something that happened in somebody's life before the census records, just through looking at newspapers. They add so much colour to an ancestor's life. thank you for listening, and again, if anybody is interested in finding out a little bit more about the Weavers Uprising, the plans for the bicentennial, and maybe even if you're possibly related to some of the people that are involved, there is a huge amount of work being done at the moment. There's a lot of effort to raise awareness about this, and they're also looking for people that might be related to the casualties at Chatterton and in other places too. So if you have a look in the description box, I will put a link to the Facebook group and anything else that I can find that may be relevant. And do let me know if you find anything of interest there.